The crow was a happy crow. It could do everything a crow can normally do, including cool stuff like flying wherever it wants to go. Then one day it comes across a dove. Oh man, the crow thinks to himself, that dove is so shiny and has some flawless feathers, whereas I'm all dark and dull. Maybe this whole crow thing isn't so great after all. So the crow flies over to the dove and says, hey man, with your shiny feathers and stuff, you must be the happiest bird in the world. The dove then explains that he was the happiest bird in the world until he met a robin. The dove tells the crow about the time he met a robin. And I was like, whoa, that is one awesome red chest you've got. I wish I had something like that rather than my plain white chest. So the crow flies to meet the robin. Like the dove, he is dazzled by the robin's awesome chest and says that there's no way that the robin can't be the happiest bird in the world right now. The robin lets off a sigh and says, well, my red chest is pretty cool, I suppose. But have you ever seen a peacock? That bird is totally way better than my red chest. Its massive feathers have eyes, or at least they look like they have eyes. There's no way that peacocks aren't the happiest birds in the world with all those incredible feathers. So the crow flies to see the peacock, and people are taking pictures of its majestic feathers. When the crowds disperse, the crow finally gets to speak to the peacock. I've never seen feathers like yours. You have to be the happiest bird in the world with those beauties. The peacock lets out a sigh and says, well, my feathers are cool, I must admit that. But I'm kept here in a cage and people take pictures of me when I'm sleeping and just trying to chill. You know, sometimes I wish I was a crow and think about how amazing it would be to be able to fly freely without anyone bothering me. Comparison is a thief of joy. And if we're not careful, comparison can also be the thief of discipleship. It can be the thief that prevents us from following Jesus. So let's go to John chapter 21. When we open up this chapter, it had been a roller coaster period of time for Peter. I mean, these last few weeks had been something. He had started out with this statement to Jesus that he would lay down his life for his master. That he didn't care what would happen, he was going to be by his side. He would not leave him alone. He was willing to die for Jesus. And then a few hours later, he was using even more strongly worded language to deny he even knew Jesus. 3 times he made those statements about not knowing Jesus, and until finally the last time, what Scripture says is Peter began to curse and swear, I don't know that man. Then he watched his Lord arrested. He watched him abused and beaten. He watched him being found guilty in a show trial. He watched him being crucified. He showed him being laid in a tomb. But then, a few days later after that, Jesus is alive again. He rose from the dead. What a roller coaster it must have been for Peter. And yet, there was probably also this cloud that was holding over Peter's head. He had denied Jesus 3 times. What would Jesus do with that? Jesus hadn't said. What are you going to do? And so as we open up John chapter 21, we read Peter say in verse 3, I'm going out to fish. He wants to get his head clear. He wants to decide and figure out what does the future hold for him. Jesus comes along. Of course, we know the story. He has this second miraculous catch of fish with these fishermen. And as they rowed ashore, Jesus has already got a breakfast fixed for them there on the beach. They have breakfast together. And then this conversation takes place beginning in verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he answered, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And then key in here, starting in the last part of verse 17. Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." This threefold: feed my sheep, take care of my sheep, feed my lambs. This statement of Jesus to Peter that, first of all, what was it that Jesus wanted Peter to hear? He finishes up the statement, this statement, "Follow me," after this conversation, and the question, I guess, comes up with what did Jesus hope Peter would hear? Apparently, this was a private conversation between Jesus and Peter, because when you get to verse 20, it says Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. After breakfast, it would seem that Jesus took Peter aside, and he has this conversation with him. What did Jesus want Peter to learn? Number one, Jesus gave Peter these three opportunities to reaffirm his love and his devotion, to make up for or to compensate for those three denials that Peter had made of Jesus a couple of weeks before. Jesus hoped Peter would concentrate on his acceptance of Peter and his acceptance of Peter into his work, rather than living a life that focused on his regret or his guilt or his sense of shame over his past and over his tragic failure that he had that night. Jesus wanted Peter to focus on his love and devotion to Jesus and following him, not on the ways that he had disappointed Jesus. Jesus wanted to focus Peter on the fact that love for Jesus is more than enthusiasm. Love is this emotion that wells up within us. And we talk about loving Jesus, and we want it to be an emotional experience. We want it to be something that just catches us and drives us through. But love is more than just enthusiasm. You notice whenever Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" After each one of those, he gives them a command. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. Peter, I've got a job for you to do. If you want to follow me, it's got to be more than just a feeling. It's got to be more than just enthusiasm for me. In his very popular book, Not a Fan, Kyle Idleman asked this question. He said, "Are you a fan or a follower?" The dictionary defines a fan as an enthusiastic admirer. Fans want to be close enough to Jesus to get all the benefits, but not so close that it requires sacrifice. Fans may be fine with repeating a prayer, attending church on the weekend, and slapping a Jesus fish on their bumpers. But is that really the extent of the relationship Jesus wants? Jesus was never interested in having admirers. It's not fans that he's looking for. Jesus hoped that Peter would concentrate on this active response to following him, rather than just giving a profession of love. If you love me, Peter, do this for me. Here's the job I'm giving you. The third thing that I see is that when a person follows Jesus, Jesus is calling them to a new calling to replace an old one in their life. Remember at the beginning of the account, Peter said, I'm going to go fishing. Now, it could be that's what he knew, that's what he did to clear his head, that's what he did to kind of get away and have some recreation. But maybe Peter was also wondering, should I go back to my old life? After all this, he had given up 3 years of following Jesus. He'd given up his livelihood. He had left the boats, he had left the fishing nets behind in order to follow Jesus. Now that Jesus had died, he had resurrected, and his relationship with Jesus in somewhat of a limbo condition right now, maybe Peter's looking at his life and saying, well, what is there left for me? I denied my Lord. Do I need to go back to fishing? And Jesus wanted Peter to understand, I have a new calling for you. I have a new responsibility for you. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. I've got something different for you than what you used to give your life to. When Jesus said, follow me in the Gospels, one of the things we need to understand about what he said is that more often than not, Jesus' words were a command. It was not a request. It wasn't, we've talked about it being an invitation, but it was an invitation that was in the form of an imperative. You do this. If you want to have a relationship with me, follow me. And this was so different than the other rabbis in Jesus' day. Other rabbis would generally wait for students to come and ask to join them, ask to be their student, ask to be able to learn from them. Well, not with Jesus. Jesus did not wait for voluntary followers. He went to them and he said, follow me. He sought disciples and he instructed them what it meant to follow him. And Jesus hoped that Peter would concentrate on this new lifelong calling that he was being given instead of going back to his old life. And number 4, one of the things that I see in what Jesus does with Peter here is he moves Peter from a life of self-direction to a life of disciple direction. Jesus has something to say to Peter about what living the life of a disciple was going to mean for him. He said it this way. He said, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. When you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. The language that Jesus is using there was understood in the Greek language, and it was understood by later Christian writers. He was telling Peter, this is the way that you're going to die. This is a reference to crucifixion. In fact, you see in the next verse, in verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. There was no question about what Jesus was saying here. Peter, if you're going to come follow me, this is what lies in store for you. This is what it's going to mean for you to glorify God. So first of all, understand on this that a call to follow Jesus, the command to follow Jesus, is a call and a command to glorify God. That whatever we do in our lives is going to be to glorify God. But it's going to be a glorification of God that is no longer led by self, it's led by Jesus. He starts out, Jesus says, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, you went where you wanted. When Peter, as a young man, he kind of called the shots. Even whenever Peter was following Jesus, Peter kind of did that on his own terms to a certain extent, didn't he? He was willing to come and go as he wanted to. He was often one who was pretty impetuous and would kind of jump out there and do whatever he thought seemed best, whatever he thought seemed right at the time. Peter's youth was characterized by this certain amount of freedom, being able to exercise that freedom however he wanted to. Now, in maturing as a disciple, Jesus turns his attention and says, you used to be that way, but now when you're old, you're going to stretch out your hands. Someone else is going to dress you. Someone else is going to lead you where you don't want to go. This command to discipleship was going to require that Peter follow a direction that he would not have chosen on his own. It was disciple-led, not self-led. What is it going to mean for us to follow Jesus? What's it going to mean for us to glorify God? Because if we're going to follow Jesus, we're going to follow him and we're going to glorify God, it will likely mean in our lives that we're going to be in situations or doing things that we would not have chosen for ourselves. Because Jesus is the one that determines that's what is going to glorify God. Remember what Paul said in Ephesians 2, verse 10. We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, and notice, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Maybe it's an oversimplification, but it's not that we submitted a proposal for this is what it would mean for me to be a disciple. I submitted a list of a bucket list of items that, this is what I'd really like to do for you, God. Would you kind of look over this and either approve it or let's talk about it. Let's go into some negotiations here before I decide whether I'm going to follow you. Now remember, follow me is a command, and it's a command to follow Jesus on his terms. And it's a command to go where he wants me to go. I'm no longer self-directed, I'm disciple-directed. Now, if Jesus' command had been a command that was literal, follow me, while he was on his earthly ministry. I mean, when he told folks, follow me, he wanted them to go where he went. He wanted them to come alongside. He wanted them to follow in his footsteps. He wanted them to literally follow him around. Now that Jesus is looking at ascending into heaven, Peter's following Jesus is no longer going to be a side-by-side relationship as such. It takes on a new meaning. It's got a new focus. Now Jesus is telling Peter, you be my disciple, you be my apostle, and as such, follow me in service. Follow me in suffering. Follow me in death by being willing to endure affliction and martyrdom for my sake. It was a concentration on being Jesus' disciple. As you think about what that means, what it means to be a disciple, which one of those speaks to you most? Do I need to learn to be devoted to Jesus and to love Jesus and to focus on my love for him and not be focused on how I've disappointed him? I mean, the disappointments need to teach us, they need to train us, they need to discipline us for discipleship. But when it comes to my relationship with Jesus, it is not defined by my past. It is not defined by my mistakes or my failures. It's defined by Jesus' call on my life. And so I respond in love and devotion. I need to concentrate on that. Maybe I need to concentrate on a life of discipleship that's more than enthusiasm. It's a life of obedience. That when Jesus calls me to follow him, he's got something in mind for me to do. It is not just something for me to enjoy in some way. Does that not mean that it brings joy? Sure. But it brings joy because I am a part of a mission that he's called me to. It is more than just enthusiasm. If I'm going to follow Jesus, I need to understand he's calling me to something new. He's calling me to something different, to replace something old in my life. That call to freedom, that call to follow Jesus is freedom from something, but it's a call to something else. So what does that mean for my life? What is it that I have given up in order to be a part of something that Jesus wants me to be a part of? Because in Jesus Christ, all things are made new. I'm a new person, and I have a new calling. Or do I need to listen to Jesus' words to Peter and understand that if I'm going to follow Jesus, it's going to be disciple-directed. It's not going to be self-directed. It's going to be something where I ask Jesus, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? And I follow his lead, not my own. I guess, the story probably would have been good if it just ended there. It'd been very meaningful, but it's not finished, of course. Peter was pretty impetuous. He had this way of kind of getting sidetracked and doing things his own way. And Peter does it here too. It's been this very serious, private moment with Jesus, and Peter suddenly changes the subject on Jesus. Verse 20. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who's going to betray you? And when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? The old movie, the movie Up, where you got the dog that is easily distracted by squirrel. That's Peter for us here, and maybe he wants to try to distract Jesus as well. Jesus, I know what you said about me, but what about him? What's your plan for him? And I guess initially my question is, what's behind Peter's question? Why does he change the subject? It may be that Peter is he's comparing himself with this other disciple. And maybe with all the disciples, but because John is closest there in proximity, he starts with John. Would John share the same level of responsibility that you've been talking about from me? Would he have the same authority? Would he have the same assignment? Would he share in the same suffering? What kind of a discipleship assignment are you going to give to John? Is it going to be higher than mine? Is it going to be lower than mine? Would Peter somehow be special? Or is John and the other disciples going to get special treatment or the same treatment? Is this going to be an equal commission? It could be all sorts of things in this comparison game that Peter oftentimes wanted to make. Throughout Jesus' ministry, the disciples played this game, didn't they? They said, which one is going to be greater? In fact, you just go back a few chapters here in John's Gospel. Whenever John and Peter are going to the tomb there in John chapter 20, starting about verse 3, and they race for the tomb whenever they hear that it's empty. And of course, John is younger, and so he outpaces Peter. He gets to the tomb first, but John stops. Peter rushes on and goes right ahead of him to be in there first. You kind of get a hint at some of this rivalry. And maybe that's what we're seeing here, some rivalry that Peter is feeling with the other disciples. But it could be that Peter's having genuine concern for this friend of his. He was a close friend. They had been in the fishing business together when Jesus called them. Maybe he had genuine concern about, okay, Jesus, I know this is what you said about me and what my future holds for me, that there's going to be suffering, there's going to be trials, there's going to be death in store for me if I follow you. What about John? And if John is going to face the same kind of things, do you think we ought to tell him? Do you think we ought to warn him, prepare him for that? It may be that Peter had good intentions, just wanted to know about John's future, but the timing couldn't have been worse. That is not what Jesus wanted to focus on right now. He wanted to focus Peter on his own assignment as a disciple and to accept its significance for him. But at that moment, Peter lost his focus. He lost his focus on what Jesus wanted for Peter and instead shifted his attention to how others would follow Jesus. Or a third possibility may be that Peter just may have been curious. We like to ask questions. Maybe the conversation had become too serious for Peter or too heavy. And he wanted to kind of get out of this uncomfortable feeling, this level of seriousness. And so he turns attention over to John and says, well, John, Jesus, let's just take a breath for a minute. Let's talk about John for a minute. Let's turn the spotlight on him. Well, whatever it is, Peter had effectively become distracted from what Jesus wanted him to focus on and instead focus on someone else. And we see what Jesus thought about this when he answers in an abrupt and to the point way. Notice Peter had turned. He says, well, what about him? In verse 22, Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Kind of paraphrase it. Jesus is saying, Peter, what business is that of yours? That's between me and John. My discipleship assignment with him is between us. I want to focus on what I want you to do. You must follow me. The statement, you must follow me, here is really an emphatic one. Whenever you look at it in the original language, it's a command again, but rather than just follow me, now Jesus turns to Peter and says, Peter, you follow me. I know you've gotten all concerned about somebody else out there right now, but I want you to follow me. I want you to focus on how you are going to follow me. How are you going to obey me? What Jesus wanted to impress on Peter is that this curiosity about John's future, though interesting, was not really that important. What was important was obedience to Jesus' command in his life. Follow me, Peter. Feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. He says, that's what I want you to be focusing on. I don't want you to be so interested in God's hidden things, in the things that you don't know, that you don't pay attention to the things that you do know and that you are to be a part of. There's work to be done. There's a task to be accomplished. And Peter, I want all of your attention to be on this. Some people are always asking questions. They're asking so many questions that their real mission in this life to receive the proper amount of, that their real mission in life fails to receive the proper amount of interest and energy. I mean, there are times when questions are good, but there are times when questions are out of order. It's been well said that a man who has been wounded by a feathered, poisoned arrow should not begin to ask, of what wood is this arrow made? Or of what bird did these feathers come? Or is the person who shot it dark or fair, short or tall? Let him do something about it first. And that's what Jesus wanted Peter to concentrate on. At this critical moment, as Jesus is restoring his relationship with Peter, he looks Peter in the eye and he says, I want you to concentrate on the mission I have for you. Don't get distracted. Don't look around. Don't look at other folks. Your mission for me, this is key, your mission for me as a disciple does not depend on anyone else. What other people do ultimately doesn't matter about whether you're going to follow me. You follow me, regardless of what anyone else does. Comparisons are only human, aren't they? I mean, Scripture's full of examples. We talked about the disciples who were always trying to figure out who was going to be greatest. In John 9, verse 38, Teacher, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name. We told him to stop because he was not one of you, or not one of us. Comparison. Jesus told a parable about some men who had been called out into a field to work. And at the end of the parable, he says, these who were hired last worked for only an hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. They compared themselves to the ones who had come later in the day. Even whenever Jesus had talked to the rich young man, and the rich young man had gone away sorrowful because Jesus had told him to sell everything he had and come follow me, Peter spoke up, Mark 10, verse 28, and he said, we've left everything to follow you, justifying himself to this man who had walked away. Comparisons run rampant. Why is that? First of all, where do they take place? Where are comparisons most common? Well, it starts with self. I compare myself to the person, that ideal person I think I should be. I compare myself to my own doubts, my own fears, my own failures, my own shortcomings. And I get distracted because I'm focused on who I think I should be or ought to be, rather than the person that Jesus wants to make of me as I obey him by following him. Oftentimes, comparisons come in relationships with other Christ followers. I want to know if I'm doing as much as someone else is, or I want to make sure I'm doing more than someone else is, or I want to make sure that what I'm doing is more significant than what someone else is doing, or I want to know if what I'm doing is as important. It just goes on as we make comparisons between ourselves and others who are following Jesus, and it takes our eyes off of Jesus and puts them instead on me. One church can compare itself with another church. Are we as big as that other church is? Are we as faithful as that other church is? Or do we have the same programming or equal programming? Are we having the same kind of growth? Are we having the same level of excitement? On and on we go as one church looks at another church, whether it be across the street, whether it be down the road, whether it be across town, whether it be across the country, and say, why can't I be like them? Instead of, why can I not be like the Lord has called me? Comparisons can rob us of our focus, our concentration on discipleship. Comparisons can even happen between ministries within a local church. Am I getting the same piece of the budget? Do I have the same number of people involved? Do I have the same number of activities? Is my visibility out in the church equal with somebody else? And I get so focused on comparing and competing with one another that I lose track of my discipleship in Jesus Christ. What forms does it take? Well, we hear people say things like, I've got to be better than everyone else as I follow Jesus. It's important to me to feel good about myself this way. Or, I don't know why, and you fill in the blank of the person's name, I don't know why he or she gets to have the discipleship assignment that they do. I could do that so much better than that person could. Or, I don't think I'll ever be as good as that other person. I don't think I'll ever have anything I can do for Jesus that will be very important or very effective, especially not as important and as effective as that person. You know what? I'll follow Jesus when I feel appreciated. If people don't notice the effort that I give, then what's the use? Distractions, comparisons. You know, it's just too hard to follow Jesus where He's put me. I don't have the strength, or I don't have the desire, or I don't have the willingness to bring glory to God in the circumstances that I'm in. Or I just have so many questions about how God works. I mean, I'll be able to follow Jesus when I understand the Bible better, or when I've got these questions answered, or when I understand God better. I get so distracted. And Jesus told Peter, Peter, I want you to get rid of the distractions. I want you to get rid of the comparisons. I want you to focus. I want you to concentrate on your mission for me as my disciple. I want you to glorify God in the assignment I'm giving you. So the question is for our learners this week, what will you do to follow me? Because after all, when it comes down to it, Jesus is saying to each one of us, you must follow me.